Today we enter into the first of a 5-week-long sequential reading from the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. And while that may not sound terribly exciting to most people, this is actually quite interesting because the church normally focuses on only Matthew, Mark, and Luke on a 3-year rotation, with one gospel each year being the focus on the Sunday readings. And John is read from time to time, especially during Holy Week. But each summer, the church gives us the 6th chapter of St. John to read. And because of that, it's probably a good reason to ask ourselves why. Why does the church ask us each year to read the same readings when the other Gospels don't get such a privilege? Hopefully over the next 5 weeks, we can continue to reflect upon that question of why does the church ask us to hear this again? Now, without coming close to possibly exhausting any of the mystery found within John chapter 6, I do hope to at least begin this journey with you today. This first installment of John's so-called Bread of Life discourse is a familiar story to most of us because it's the only miraculous story from Jesus' time and ministry in Galilee, which is recounted in all 4 of the Gospels. This feeding of the 5,000 is indeed a remarkable example of the Lord's power over the material universe. But it was, and it continues to be, an extremely important gospel to Christians, but especially to the early Christians. Because it was believed that all the Gospels were written in Greek originally, though some people argue that at least one of them perhaps was written in Latin. And when you translate things from one language into another, you oftentimes lose some of the finesse or the subtlety that the language conveys, that the authors chose to use. And one of these subtle things which Jesus did in today's reading would have not been such a subtle thing to those early Christians who would have known Greek. Jesus gave thanks. Giving thanks is a word that we all would know in English, a Greek borrowed word, Eucharist. The Eucharist, giving thanks. And because of this, John chapter 6 can be seen as a prelude to the Mass. Jesus will institute the Eucharist in 1 year's time at Passover, when in the upper room he took bread and gave thanks and gave it to his disciples. And he said, "This is my body, this is my blood." And then he completed his Eucharistic sacrifice when he offered himself upon the cross for us. Jesus took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. There's another wonderful clue to someone who would have read this gospel in the Greek, because the same word, when Jesus has distributed the bread, is found again at the Last Supper. Jesus uses a word here in John 6 that is not normally used for bread. Rather, literally, it means the broken bits. Gather up the fragments, the broken bits. But an early Christian would have heard the same words used to describe the bread made his flesh at the Last Supper. He took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. This reading from the Gospel is supposed to inform our understanding of the Eucharist, of the Mass, in some way. Not only does its location within the Gospel lead up to the great teaching of Jesus on his body and his blood, and his command of us to eat of it and drink of it, but it is also uses the same words which Jesus uses at the Last Supper. It's entirely Eucharistic. All of John 6 points to one thing, the Eucharist. But in this, he also gives us a commandment. And that's what I want to focus the short remainder of this homily on. He says, gather up the fragments so that nothing will be wasted. The Eucharist is the greatest treasure of the church. The Eucharist is the greatest treasure of the church. Why is that? Because it is Christ himself. It is Jesus present. It's not only a symbol, it's also a reality. St. Paul VI, who was the Pope of most of the Second Vatican Council, thought that we as a people had perhaps lost that understanding of what the Eucharist truly is. So in 1969, he wrote a letter to the Catholics of the world, and he said this: the fact that a lay Christian is now able to receive Holy Communion in the hand should not suggest to him that it is ordinary bread or just any sacred object. No matter which method is chosen, that is reception of Eucharist on the tongue or reception in the hand, he says one will be careful not to allow any fragment of the host to fall. Now, accidents happen, of course, and we can take care of the situation when the Eucharist may fall. But the Church greatly desires that we gather up and we protect this greatest treasure that the Church has, the greatest treasure that Jesus himself gave to us. And this is why priests are asked to be so meticulous when we are purifying the vessels at the altar after communion. And it's why all Christians are called to be attentive to the possibility of any fragment or particle, no matter how small, of the Eucharist that might remain on their hands after receiving. We're all called and commanded by Christ to gather up the fragments that nothing may be lost. Because it is Jesus himself, and it remains Jesus, no matter how small the particle may be. And I just wish to end with just a short story. I heard this from a recording of Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who was an American bishop in the 20th century who had a very famous television show called Life is Worth Living. His cause for canonization, his cause for being proclaimed a saint, is open, and he claims in his autobiography that this story changed his life. He recounts this story that a Chinese priest who escaped communist China after the communist revolution there told him. And the story goes that this Chinese priest was beginning to say Mass when, at the start of Mao Zedong's communist revolution in China, and the communist guard broke into the church and put him under house arrest. Now, the church and the rectory were a combined building, so he had a small window that he could look into the church from his rectory. And there he saw the guards, the police, break down the various aspects of the church, break into the tabernacle, and throw the Eucharist upon the ground, and steal the sacred vessels that were containing the Eucharist. He decided that since he was unable to go and do anything about it, since he was locked in his own house, the only thing that he could do was make adoration and prayer of reparation to our Lord in the most blessed sacrament. And so one night when he was praying, he noticed a little girl, about 11 years old, who had slipped past the guards and had entered into the church. She knelt down in front of those hosts that had been strewn upon the ground, and she knelt there for an hour. She prayed to Jesus in the Eucharist, and after that hour, she bent over and received the Eucharist on her tongue, because at the time, reception in the hand was not allowed. She did this every night for a month. She snuck into the church past armed guards, prayed, adored Jesus in the Eucharist, and then received communion. The last time that she was able to do this was the very last host that had been left upon the ground. And after she had received communion, she knocked something over in the church, made a noise, and was shot dead by the communist guard. That small Chinese girl knew what treasure lay despised upon the ground of her church, and she risked her life every night for a month in order to rectify that situation in the only way that she knew how. I pray that we may all come to know, love, and adore Jesus in the Eucharist in the same way that that small girl did. May we all know what great treasure we have here in the church for us, Christ himself in the Eucharist. And let us do all that we can to gather up the fragments so that nothing may be lost.